Picture this: the golden age of Hollywood. Glittering premieres, glamorous stars draped in diamonds, and passionate romances splashed across every tabloid. But behind the velvet curtains and locked studio doors, there existed an entire hidden world that the public was never meant to see. A world where some of cinema's most beautiful and talented women found love, passion, and connection with each other. This is the story of old Hollywood's secret Sapphic world, where legendary actresses defied not just the moral codes of their time, but the very studios that made them stars. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets. We're talking about icons whose faces you know, whose films you've watched, but whose true stories have been buried for nearly a century. These weren't just whispered rumors in darkened speakeasies. These were real relationships, genuine love affairs, and intimate connections that had to be hidden from a world that wasn't ready to accept them. From the smoky cabarets of 1920s Berlin to the exclusive parties at William Randolph Hearst's castle, from the carefully staged publicity marriages to the passionate letters that were destroyed by executors after death, we're going to explore the double lives of Hollywood's most fascinating women. Let's start our journey in the wild, decadent world of 1920s Berlin, where a young dancer named Anita Berber was shocking audiences and revolutionizing what it meant to be free. Born in 1899 in Leipzig, Germany, Berber was a force of nature in a time when women were expected to be demure and proper. By the time she was in her 20s, she had become one of the most talked-about performers in Weimar Berlin, performing dances with titles like Cocaine and Morphium in costumes that consisted of little more than strategically placed beads and her trademark bob haircut. But what made Berber truly revolutionary wasn't just her nearly nude dancing or her open drug use. It was her absolute refusal to hide her bisexuality in an era when such openness could destroy careers and land people in prison. Berber's story reads like something out of a fever dream. She married a man named Eberhard von Nathesins in 1919, but it was clearly a marriage of convenience. She left him almost immediately to pursue a relationship with a woman named Susie Wanowski, becoming a prominent figure in Berlin's lesbian scene. In 1922, she married her dance partner Sebastian Droste, but this relationship was equally unconventional. Both Berber and Droste were openly bisexual, and their partnership was more about artistic collaboration than traditional matrimony. Together, they created a book called Dances of Vice, Horror, and Ecstasy that became a sensation in the avant-garde art world. What's fascinating about Berber is that she didn't just live her truth privately. She flaunted it. In an era when even wearing pants could be considered scandalous for a woman, Berber performed half-naked, had affairs with both men and women, and made no apologies for any of it. Her favorite method of getting intoxicated involved stirring chloroform and ether in a bowl with a white rose, then eating the petals. She would appear at clubs with her lover Susie, making no attempt to hide their relationship. The public was both scandalized and mesmerized. Unfortunately, Berber's wild lifestyle caught up with her. After years of addiction to cocaine, morphine, and alcohol, and suffering from severe tuberculosis, she collapsed while performing in Damascus. She returned to Germany and died in a Berlin hospital in 1928 at just 29 years old, supposedly surrounded by empty morphine syringes. She was buried in a pauper's grave, a tragic end for someone who had burned so brightly. But Berber's legacy lived on. Her radical openness about her sexuality and her artistic daring influenced a generation of performers, including many who would eventually make their way to Hollywood. Her story shows us that even in the 1920s, there were women who refused to live by society's rules, who chose authenticity over acceptance. And as we'll see, this spirit of defiance would follow many performers across the Atlantic to America's dream factory. Now let's cross the ocean to Hollywood, where the stakes were even higher and the secrets had to be kept even tighter. In the carefully controlled world of the studio system, everything about a star's life was manufactured, from their name to their biography to their romantic relationships. And in this world of manufactured perfection, there was no room for anything that didn't fit the wholesome image the studios wanted to project, which made life incredibly complicated for the women who loved other women. Enter Greta Garbo, the Swedish sphinx whose face launched 1,000 magazine covers. Born Greta Gustafsson in Stockholm in 1905, Garbo arrived in Hollywood in 1925 and quickly became one of the most enigmatic and fascinating stars in cinema history. With her luminous beauty, her melancholic screen presence, and her mysterious personal life, Garbo captivated audiences worldwide. But behind the carefully constructed mystique was a woman with a secret that she guarded fiercely throughout her life. Garbo's relationships with women were the subject of intense speculation throughout her career, though the full truth wouldn't emerge until long after her death. One of her most significant relationships was with the writer Mercedes de Acosta, a lesbian playwright and poet who moved in Hollywood's most exclusive circles. De Acosta was known for her affairs with famous women, and her relationship with Garbo was one of the most passionate and enduring. They met in the late 1920s, and their connection was immediate and intense. De Acosta wrote love letters to Garbo that dripped with longing and devotion, addressing her as "my beloved" and expressing emotions that went far beyond simple friendship. What's particularly poignant about Garbo's story is how desperately she tried to maintain her privacy. She famously said she wanted to be alone, and this wasn't just about avoiding fans and paparazzi. It was about protecting herself and the women she loved from a world that would never understand. Garbo never married, despite numerous proposals from powerful men in Hollywood. She lived independently, controlled her own career with an iron will, and created a life on her own terms. When she retired from films in 1941 at the height of her career, she simply walked away, spending the rest of her life as a recluse in New York City, guarding her secrets until her death in 1990. But Garbo wasn't the only one hiding her truth behind a carefully crafted public persona. Marlene Dietrich, the German-born actress who became one of Hollywood's most glamorous stars, was living an equally complex double life. Born in Berlin in 1901, Dietrich shot to international fame with her role in The Blue Angel in 1930, then moved to Hollywood where she became one of Paramount Pictures' biggest stars. With her sultry voice, her impeccable style, and her willingness to wear men's clothing on and off screen, Dietrich became an icon of sophisticated sexuality. What the public didn't know was that Dietrich's sexuality was as fluid as her fashion choices. She was married to Rudolf Sieber from 1923 until his death in 1976, but their marriage was what we'd call an open relationship today. Both had numerous affairs, and Dietrich's affairs with women were numerous and intense. She had relationships with actresses, writers, and socialites throughout her career. Her affair with Mercedes de Acosta actually overlapped with de Acosta's relationship with Garbo, creating a complicated love triangle that would make for quite a drama itself. Dietrich was more open about her bisexuality than many of her contemporaries, at least within her inner circle. She would appear at parties in her signature men's suits, kiss women in public at private gatherings, and make no secret of her attractions to both sexes among friends. But publicly, she maintained the image of a glamorous heterosexual siren. The studios and the press were complicit in this charade, carefully editing out anything that might suggest Dietrich's true nature. When she wore a tuxedo in Morocco and kissed another woman on screen in 1930, it was presented as daring and provocative, but ultimately just an act. The idea that Dietrich might actually desire women in real life was never acknowledged. Now let's talk about Katharine Hepburn, the four-time Oscar winner who defined independence and strength in Hollywood for over 6 decades. Born in Connecticut in 1907 to progressive parents who encouraged free thinking and debate, Hepburn brought that same spirit of independence to Hollywood. She wore pants when it was scandalous, she spoke her mind when women were expected to be demure, and she lived life entirely on her own terms. Hepburn's 26-year relationship with Spencer Tracy is Hollywood legend, but what's less discussed is her close relationships with women throughout her life. Hepburn lived with Laura Harding, an heiress and actress, for several years in the 1930s. Their relationship was so close that Harding appeared as an extra in several of Hepburn's films just so they could spend more time together. The exact nature of their relationship has been debated by biographers, but contemporaries described their bond as being far more than simple friendship. Hepburn also had an intense decades-long friendship with director Dorothy Arzner, one of the few openly lesbian directors in Hollywood. These relationships were kept carefully under wraps, with the studios ensuring that Hepburn's image remained that of a strong but ultimately heterosexual woman. What's fascinating about Hepburn is how she managed to be both unconventional and accepted. She challenged gender norms with her clothing and behavior, she refused to play the Hollywood game of publicity and interviews, and she had relationships that defied easy categorization. Yet she became one of the most respected actresses in Hollywood history. Perhaps it was because her unconventionality was framed as eccentricity rather than sexuality. Or perhaps it was because she had the strength and the star power to simply refuse to conform, and Hollywood had no choice but to accept her on her terms. Let's shift our focus now to another fascinating figure, Louise Brooks, the silent film star whose iconic bob haircut influenced fashion for generations. Born in Kansas in 1906, Brooks started as a dancer before becoming one of the most striking faces of the silent era. Her performances in German films like Pandora's Box in 1929 made her an international sensation, with her natural, understated acting style revolutionizing screen performance. But Brooks's personal life was as complex as her screen presence was simple. Brooks was openly sexual in a way that scandalized even Hollywood. She had affairs with numerous men, including Charlie Chaplin, but she also had relationships with women that were equally passionate. One of her closest companions was Pepe Lydia, the lesbian niece of actress Marion Davies and newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. Brooks and Lydia were constant companions, attending parties together at Hearst Castle and living a lifestyle that pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable. When Hearst discovered Lydia's lesbianism, he had her committed to a mental institution for drug addiction. Days later, Lydia jumped to her death from a hospital window. Brooks was devastated, and some biographers believe this trauma contributed to her eventual departure from Hollywood and her decades of alcoholism and depression. Brooks's honesty about sexuality extended to her later writings. After being rediscovered by film scholars in the 1950s, she wrote extensively about her life and career. While she never explicitly confirmed her relationships with women, her writings contained enough hints and references that scholars have pieced together a picture of a woman whose sexuality was far more fluid than the heterosexual roles she played on screen. Now we come to Barbara Stanwyck, the Brooklyn-born actress who became one of Hollywood's most versatile and highest-paid stars. Born Ruby Stevens in 1907, Stanwyck had a hardscrabble childhood that made her tough and independent. By the 1940s, she was earning more than almost any other woman in America, with a string of hits that ranged from screwball comedies to hard-boiled film noir. Stanwyck was married twice, most notably to actor Robert Taylor, but rumors about her relationships with women persisted throughout her career. The whispers about Stanwyck centered on her close relationships with several women in Hollywood, including actress Claudette Colbert, with whom she was frequently photographed at private parties and vacations. There were also rumors about her mentorship of younger actresses that went beyond professional interest. Stanwyck was known for being intensely private about her personal life, refusing to discuss relationships in interviews and maintaining strict boundaries with the press. This privacy has made it difficult for biographers to definitively document her relationships with women, but the rumors were persistent enough that they've become part of Hollywood legend. What's interesting about Stanwyck is how she navigated the masculine roles she often played. She was frequently cast as tough, independent women who could handle themselves in a man's world. In The Lady Eve, Double Indemnity, and dozens of other films, she played women who were smarter, tougher, and more capable than the men around them. Some scholars have suggested that these roles allowed Stanwyck to express aspects of her personality and possibly her sexuality that couldn't be acknowledged in her public life. She became America's favorite working girl, beloved for her strength and independence, even as she carefully hid anything that might complicate that image. Claudette Colbert, who we just mentioned, deserves her own moment in our story. Born in Paris in 1903 and raised in New York, Colbert became one of Hollywood's most sophisticated and successful actresses. She won an Oscar for It Happened One Night in 1934 and starred in some of the most popular films of the 1930s and 1940s. Colbert was known for her intelligence, her business savvy, and her absolute control over her image. She was married twice, but like many actresses of her era, there were persistent rumors about relationships with women. Colbert's friendships with certain actresses were notably intense. She traveled frequently with female companions, maintained separate residences from her husbands, and lived independently in a way that was unusual even for a Hollywood star. After retiring from films, she spent most of her time in Barbados with a female companion, Joel Pressman's widow Verna Hull. While Colbert never publicly addressed questions about her sexuality, The pattern of her life suggests a woman who valued her independence and her relationships with women above the conventional expectations of marriage. The tragic figure of Joan Crawford looms large in any discussion of old Hollywood's hidden histories. Born Lucille LeSueur in Texas in 1904, Crawford clawed her way from poverty to become one of MGM's biggest stars and a 4-time Oscar nominee, winning once for Mildred Pierce in 1945. Crawford was married 4 times and had numerous high-profile relationships with men, but there were also whispers about her relationships with women that have intrigued biographers for decades. Crawford's closest relationships with women were often framed as intense friendships, but several contemporaries suggested they went deeper. Her friendship with actress Barbara Stanwyck was particularly close, with the two women frequently traveling together and maintaining what insiders described as an unusually intimate bond. There were also rumors about her relationships with younger actresses she mentored at MGM. What's particularly sad about Crawford's story is how desperate she was for love and acceptance, yet how carefully she had to guard anything that might damage her carefully constructed image as Hollywood royalty. Josephine Baker deserves special attention in our story, though her connection to Hollywood was more tangential than the others. Born in St. Louis in 1906, Baker became an international sensation as a dancer and singer, primarily in France. She was the first black woman to star in a major motion picture, the 1927 French film Siren of the Tropics. Baker's performances in Paris, including her famous banana skirt costume, made her one of the most photographed and talked about entertainers of the 1920s and 1930s. Baker was openly bisexual in the more tolerant atmosphere of 1920s and 1930s Paris. She had affairs with both men and women, and among her circle of friends and lovers were numerous women from the worlds of entertainment, art, and high society. Baker's life was extraordinary in every way. She was not only a groundbreaking entertainer but also a French resistance spy during World War II, a civil rights activist, and the adoptive mother of 12 children of different races and religions whom she called her Rainbow Tribe. Her openness about her sexuality in France contrasts sharply with what would have been required of her had she pursued a career in Hollywood, where the racial prejudice alone would have severely limited her opportunities, let alone any acknowledgement of her bisexuality. The story of these women can't be told without discussing the elaborate system that kept their secrets hidden. The Hollywood studio system of the 1920s through 1950s was essentially a factory for manufacturing stars, and that manufacturing process extended to every aspect of an actor's life. Studios employed teams of publicists, lawyers, and fixers whose job it was to create and maintain the public images of their stars. This included arranging publicity dates, creating romance rumors, and even arranging marriages of convenience to dispel gossip about homosexuality. These so-called lavender marriages were common in Hollywood. 2 gay or lesbian stars would marry each other, providing cover for both. Or a lesbian actress would marry a gay actor, allowing both to maintain their careers while living private lives that had nothing to do with their public relationships. The studios saw this as simply good business. A scandal about homosexuality could destroy not just an actor's career but could taint the studio's entire reputation and impact the box office for all their films. The press was complicit in this system. Powerful gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons knew the truth about many stars' private lives but kept silent, understanding that their access to studios and stars depended on playing along with the charade. When Hopper or Parsons did write about homosexuality, it was usually in veiled terms, with phrases like confirmed bachelor or very close friends that regular readers learned to decode. But the full truth was never printed in mainstream publications. The impact of this system on the women who lived through it cannot be overstated. Imagine living every moment of your life in fear that one photograph, one overheard conversation, one disgruntled former lover could destroy everything you'd worked for. Imagine having to hide your true self from the world, to present a false image day after day, year after year. Imagine watching the person you love most in the world but never being able to acknowledge that love publicly, never being able to build a recognized life together, never being able to mourn publicly if that person died. Many of these women dealt with the stress through alcohol and prescription drugs. Others became reclusive, limiting their social lives to small circles of trusted friends who knew and accepted them. Some married men they didn't love, had children they may not have wanted, all to maintain the illusion. And some, like Greta Garbo, simply walked away from Hollywood entirely rather than continue living the lie. The double standard was particularly cruel. Male homosexuality in Hollywood was equally taboo, of course, but the studios and society tended to be slightly more forgiving of artistic men who were a bit effeminate or who never married. For women, the expectations were different. A woman was supposed to want marriage and children above all else. A woman who was too independent, too outspoken, too unwilling to play the traditional feminine role was already suspect. Add in any hint of lesbianism, and careers could end overnight. There were also questions of class and race that complicated everything. White women of a certain status could get away with unconventional behavior that would have been immediately punished in women of color or working-class women. Marlene Dietrich could wear tuxedos and kiss women on screen because she was positioned as a sophisticated European, above the mundane morality of ordinary Americans. Josephine Baker could be more open about her bisexuality in Paris partly because she was positioned as an exotic, outside the normal rules. But for most women in Hollywood, there was no such protective buffer. The medical establishment of the era made things even worse. Homosexuality was classified as a mental illness, and many gay and lesbian people were subjected to horrific treatments ranging from electroshock therapy to lobotomies. The threat of being institutionalized was real. We mentioned earlier how Pipi Ledia was committed by her powerful uncle and ended up dead. This wasn't an isolated incident. Families regularly committed gay and lesbian relatives to asylums, and once there, those people could be subjected to any number of cruel and abusive treatments, all in the name of curing them. Against this backdrop of fear and oppression, the relationships these women managed to build with each other become even more remarkable. They found each other in the darkness, created spaces where they could be themselves, and built communities of support and love that sustained them through incredibly difficult times. Private parties at the homes of understanding hosts became safe spaces where women could dance together, express affection publicly, and simply be themselves for a few hours. Certain nightclubs, particularly those in more bohemian neighborhoods, became gathering places where the rules were more relaxed. Mercedes de Acosta, whom we mentioned earlier, was central to one of these communities. Her home in Hollywood became a salon where lesbian and bisexual women in the entertainment industry could gather, talk freely, and find companionship. De Acosta's guest books read like a who's who of Hollywood's elite, and many of the relationships that formed at her parties lasted for years, sustained by this network of women who understood each other's struggles. There were also geographical safe spaces. Certain European cities, particularly Paris and Berlin before the rise of the Nazis, were more tolerant of homosexuality than American cities. Many Hollywood stars made frequent trips to Europe, ostensibly for work or vacation, but actually to spend time in places where they could be more open about their relationships. The French Riviera, in particular, became a favorite destination for Hollywood stars, including several of the women we've discussed, who could live more freely in the more tolerant atmosphere. The impact of all this secrecy on the women's art is impossible to calculate but was undoubtedly significant. How many great love stories went untold because they couldn't be acknowledged? How many performances were informed by real emotions that audiences never suspected? When Greta Garbo played tragic heroines separated from their loves, was she drawing on her own experience of hidden relationships? When Marlene Dietrich sang songs of longing and loss, was she thinking of the women she couldn't publicly claim? Some scholars have suggested that the enforced secrecy actually added depth to these actresses' performances. Unable to express their true selves in life, they poured that emotion and complexity into their screen roles. The mystery and melancholy that made Garbo so compelling, the sophisticated worldliness that defined Dietrich, the fierce independence of Hepburn and Stanwyck, all of these qualities may have been shaped by the double lives these women were forced to lead. As we move into the 1950s and 1960s, the picture becomes even more complex. The studio system was breaking down, giving stars more independence but also less protection. The rise of television and changing social mores meant that the old rules were shifting, but not necessarily in ways that made life easier for lesbian and bisexual women in entertainment. The 1950s were, in many ways, even more conservative than the 1930s and 1940s had been. The Cold War brought with it intense paranoia about anything un-American, and homosexuality was lumped in with communism as a threat to American values. Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade included persecution of gay and lesbian people in government and entertainment. The FBI kept files on suspected homosexuals in Hollywood, and many careers were destroyed by mere rumors. In this atmosphere, women who had managed to maintain their careers through the 1940s became even more careful, even more closeted. Some left Hollywood entirely. Others married for the first time or remarried, seeking the protection of conventional relationships. But there were also signs of change. The 1960s brought a new openness about sexuality in general, even if homosexuality remained taboo. Independent films began to explore themes that Hollywood had long suppressed. And a new generation of actresses, influenced by the pioneers we've been discussing, began to push boundaries in new ways. They couldn't be completely open, not yet, but they could be more honest than their predecessors had been allowed to be. By the time many of these women died, Dietrich in 1992, Hepburn in 2003, Garbo in 1990, the world was beginning to change. Their obituaries mentioned their relationships with men but remained silent about their relationships with women. It wasn't until biographies began to appear in the years and decades after their deaths that the fuller picture began to emerge. Letters were discovered, diaries were published, and people who had been part of their inner circles finally felt free to speak more openly. Today, as we look back at these women, we see them with new eyes. We understand that their carefully constructed images, while partly the result of studio machinations, were also forms of self-protection in a hostile world. We recognize that their fierce independence wasn't just personality quirk but necessity. They couldn't depend on the traditional structures of marriage and family, so they had to build lives that could stand on their own. We appreciate that their artistry was shaped not just by talent and technique but by lived experience of hiding, yearning, and finding love in the shadows. The legacy of these women is complex. On one hand, their closeted lives reflected and reinforced the oppression of their era. They couldn't be role models for young lesbian and bisexual women because their true selves were hidden. On the other hand, they survived in an impossible situation, created meaningful lives and relationships despite enormous obstacles, and left behind bodies of work that continue to inspire and entertain. They were both victims of their time and victors over it, constrained by society but finding ways to live authentically within those constraints. It's important to note that we can't know everything about these women's private lives with certainty. Unlike today, where many LGBTQ+ people document their lives and relationships openly, these women lived in an era when letters were burned, diaries were destroyed, and the truth was actively suppressed. Many of the women who knew them best maintained their secrets even after death, honoring promises of privacy that stretched beyond the grave. So while we have strong evidence for much of what we've discussed, there are also gaps, uncertainties, and things we may never know for sure. What we do know is that Hollywood's golden age, for all its glamour and magic, was built partly on lies and enforced conformity. The dream factory that gave us so much joy and entertainment also demanded that its workers sacrifice their authentic selves on the altar of public image. And for women who loved women, that sacrifice was particularly painful. But here's the beautiful thing: love found a way. Despite everything stacked against them, these women found each other. They created lives of meaning and passion. They loved deeply, even if they couldn't love openly. They built communities of support that sustained them through impossible times. And they left us with art that, when viewed with knowledge of their true lives, takes on new layers of meaning and poignancy. When we watch Greta Garbo now, knowing about Mercedes de Acosta and the other women in her life, we see her legendary mysteriousness differently. It wasn't just a screen persona. It was protection, a veil behind which she could live her truth. When we see Marlene Dietrich in her tuxedo, it's not just gender-bending for shock value. It's a glimpse of her authentic self, the woman who refused to be confined by anyone's expectations. When we watch Katharine Hepburn's independent women standing up to the men around them, we recognize echoes of her own refusal to conform. These women were pioneers, even if they couldn't acknowledge it at the time. They proved that women could be powerful, independent, and successful without fitting into traditional molds. They created space for the actresses who came after them to be more open, more honest, more fully themselves. Every time a modern actress talks openly about her same-sex partner, she's building on the foundation these women laid, even if that foundation had to be hidden underground. As we close this journey through old Hollywood's secret Sapphic world, let's remember these women not just for their glamour and talent, though they had both in abundance. Let's remember them for their courage in finding love where it was forbidden, their resilience in maintaining themselves despite enormous pressure to conform, and their determination to live as authentically as their dangerous era would allow. They were stars on screen, but they were also warriors in life, fighting battles most people never knew about. Their stories remind us how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. While things have improved dramatically for LGBTQ+ people in the entertainment industry, challenges remain. But every time someone lives openly and authentically, they honor the memory of these women who couldn't. Every time someone tells a queer love story on screen, they're doing what Garbo and Dietrich and Hepburn never could. Every time someone refuses to let their identity be erased or hidden, they're carrying forward the legacy of these secret pioneers. So here's to the women of old Hollywood who loved in the shadows but lived in the spotlight. Here's to the relationships that couldn't be acknowledged, the letters that were burned, the lives that were hidden. Here's to Anita Berber, dancing naked and free in Weimar, Berlin. Here's to Greta Garbo, walking away from fame to protect her truth. Here's to Marlene Dietrich, refusing to let anyone define her. Here's to Katharine Hepburn, living on her own terms for 9 decades. Here's to Barbara Stanwyck and Claudette Colbert and Joan Crawford and all the others who navigated impossible waters with grace and strength. Their secrets are coming to light now, decades after most of them have passed. We're piecing together their stories from fragments and hints, letters and rumors, the memories of those who knew them and the careful analysis of scholars. And in doing so, we're finally giving them what they never had in life, the chance to be seen fully, loved completely, and honored truly for exactly who they were. The next time you watch one of their films, remember, you're not just watching a performance. You're watching a woman who had to hide her truth from the world, who loved in secret, who built a life in the margins of what was allowed. And somehow, despite everything, she created magic that still moves us today. That's not just talent. That's not just star quality. That's the power of the human spirit refusing to be completely contained, finding ways to express truth even when direct expression is impossible. This is the secret Sapphic world of old Hollywood, not so secret anymore, but no less remarkable for being brought into the light. These women loved, they lived, they triumphed, and they deserve to be remembered for all of who they were, not just the carefully edited versions the studios wanted us to see. Their legacy is complicated, their stories are still being discovered, but their impact on film and culture is undeniable. They were legends then, and they're legends now, just finally, fully, honestly themselves.